I was sipping a beer in the shade when the football bounced into my garden. The thing almost made me jump. I'd had my eyes closed, enjoying the warmth and the birdsong, when it thumped onto the grass 10 meters from where I was sitting. I stared at it and rolled my eyes. Nathan. Sure enough, only a couple of minutes later the kid appeared. First a mop of yellow hair stuck up over my back gate, and then 2 worried eyes followed. I've lived next to Nathan and his family for a few months now, but I still haven't got used to how nervous the kid looks. He's like a little blonde rabbit. One that never managed to find refuge from the headlights. Nathan didn't see me. I was sat back at the edge of the garden, in the shadows of my silver birch. I didn't move as he let himself through the back gate. Cruel, I know, but I thought I'd have some fun with him. Nathan picked his way slowly across the grass. His blue eyes were wide. As I watched, I saw them flicking between the place where his ball had landed and the windows of my house. He was concentrating so hard that he walked straight by me without noticing. Grinning, I stood up. I placed my beer silently on the grass and crept after Nathan. I waited until he'd reached his ball before I spoke. What do you think you're doing? I tell you, I wish I'd been filming it. The kid damn near jumped out of his skin. He spun around on the spot, once again reminding me of a frightened animal, and it was only when his eyes found me that some of the shock drained from his face. He put a hand to his chest and pulled in deep breaths. Mr. Andrews. Nathan's face was a pale moon. You made me jump. I couldn't help but grin. I can see that. And how many times do I need to tell you to call me Paul, Nathan? Sorry, Paul. The kid smiled at me. He seemed to have almost recovered. He was still breathing fast, but some of the color had crept back into his face. I didn't see you sitting there. For a minute I thought. He trailed off and his eyes left mine. They flicked back to the windows of my house, then down to the football at his feet. He fidgeted. For a minute you thought what? No, nothing. You just made me jump, that's all. I rolled my eyes. Come on, Nathan. You've lived next door to me now for what, 3 months? 4? Right, 4. We've chatted a bunch of times since then, too. I know I live on my own and I'm not exactly young anymore, but you can't tell me I'm at the age where kids are starting to get scared of me. I grinned at Nathan to make it clear I was kidding. After a few seconds, he grinned back. Then his eyes went to the windows of my house again, and his smile faded. It's not you, Mr. and sorry, Paul. It's your house. My house. I followed Nathan's gaze. To be fair, my house does look sort of imposing. It's set at the end of the row of homes in our village, and it's the oldest by quite some way. Maybe even 17th century. The place looks its age, too. Faded, crumbling bricks. Half-rotted wood. Dark windows that look ever so slightly like eyes. If I hadn't lived there so long, the place would probably give me the creeps too. And I could only imagine what a 10-year-old kid might think of it. Go on then, Nathan. I raised my eyebrows. What do your friends say about my house? He stared up at me with his round eyes, and I smiled back at him. I promise I won't mind. I'm just interested to hear what stories the kids these days come up with to scare themselves. Nathan took a long look at the house, then stared back at me. He lowered his voice, as if scared the building might hear him. Some of the kids I've met say it's a gateway to hell, he whispered. Down in the basement. They say if anyone goes down there, they don't come back. I snorted. Gateway to hell, eh? Well, I have to give your friends credit. That's way more original than the stuff we scared each other with when I was young. What else do they say? Nathan's eyes were wide. Well, you know that little kid who went missing in the New Forest a couple of years back? George Willow or something? Willett. George Willett. Of course I remembered George. For a while, before the main search had died down, the kid's face had been on the front of every paper. You couldn't get away from him. Right, continued Nathan. Well, you know Tim Castwell, who lives over by the church. He says he knows someone who went to school with George, and they said George sometimes used to go on bike rides near here. Yeah, well. Nathan glanced once more at the house, then looked back at me. Tim reckons maybe George heard rumors about the basement too, or something. He could have tried to sneak in there and see for himself, maybe. I bit down the urge to laugh. I'm not saying 10-year-old kids aren't subtle or anything, Nathan, but I think I might have noticed if one broke into my house and went rooting around in the basement. Nathan shrugged. Then a second later, he frowned. So there is one, then? What? A basement. I sighed. Yes, there's a basement. But as far as I remember, it's mainly old boxes and garden tools down there. Not much in the way of fiery portals. I paused and looked around the garden. My deck chair was positioned in the shade of the silver birch, the beer forgotten beside it. I sighed again. Tell you what, I said. Why don't you see for yourself? What? The basement. Why don't I show you how unimpressive it actually is? Then you can spread the word for me. I can't imagine Tim Castwell is going to be breaking in anytime soon, but I know how these ghost stories get started. At least if you tell the other kids how dull it really is, then I won't have to worry about getting a burglar alarm installed. Nathan stared down at the football by his feet. Then he looked up at the house. There was a frown on his face, and I could see him chewing his lower lip. At the very least, it'll give you some points in the playground, I continued. Tim Castwell can tell all the stories he wants, but you're the only one who have experienced a horror firsthand. Nathan stared at me. I grinned at him again. After a few seconds, he smiled back. You'll have to excuse the mess, I said, skirting some shoes in the hallway and making my way into the living room. I was never the tidiest of people, but I suppose my wife kept me in check. Since she passed away, I've gotten a bit lax with the cleaning. Nathan didn't say anything. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him a couple of paces behind me, his rabbit eyes as wide as ever. He hadn't spoken a word since we walked through the front door. To be fair, there was plenty to distract him. I've always been a bit of a collector. A hoarder, too. It's the dangerous combination. My lounge is stuffed full of antiques and bric-a-brac. Old figurines stare out from dusty shelves. Books are piled up everywhere. The lounge features a large, inglenook fireplace, which even includes a stone gargoyle I bought at auction a few years back. The stuff looks impressive, at least in my opinion, but I suppose it does create something of a haunted house effect. I used to deal antiques, I explained to Nathan. We were at the far end of the lounge now, near the back of the house. I stepped through a door and entered a smaller hallway. I gave up the selling part, but I guess I never stopped buying. Nathan stayed quiet. I could see his eyes combing the walls, flicking between the cobwebs and the faded black and white photos. I continued past the downstairs bathroom on my left, then paused by a narrow staircase on the right. An old wooden door stood next to the stairs. I pointed it out to Nathan. Here we are, I said. That's the door that leads down to the dreaded basement. What the hell, if you want to believe Tim Castwell. Nathan stared at it. His face was pale in the darkness of the hallway, but the whites of his eyes were bright. It took him a few seconds to find his voice. This is it. What's the matter? I said. Not as dramatic as you were expecting. When Nathan failed to respond, I gestured towards the door again. Go on then, I said. Why don't you take a look? There's a short flight of steps that go down, but if you stand at the top you'll be able to see all you need to see. By which I mean the mountains of boxes, and the notable lack of any inferno. I smiled again, but Nathan didn't see. His eyes were locked on the door. He took a step towards it, then another. As he came to a stop in front of the ancient wood, I felt the faint rustle of butterflies in my stomach. How long had it been since I'd been down into the basement? I couldn't remember. The only thing I knew for certain was that the door hadn't been opened in a long time. The wood looked dirty and rotten. Nathan took hold of the handle. His words from earlier suddenly drifted back to me. Some of the kids I've met say it's a gateway to hell. Down in the basement. They say if anyone goes down there, they don't come back. Nathan opened the door. It creaked inwards on tired hinges. Darkness loomed beyond it like an open throat. Darkness, but nothing else. I heard Nathan let out a breath as he stood on the top step. You see? I said to him. It's just a basement, I guess. Nathan edged closer to the darkness. He wrinkled his nose. Although it does smell kind of, I stepped forward and shoved him. The kid didn't make a sound. 1 minute he was standing in the doorway, the next he'd vanished into the basement's black mouth like an insect down a plug hole. I heard his body crashing down the steps, followed by a muffled snapping sound as he hit the concrete floor at the bottom. Then nothing. I stood on the top step, breathing fast. The butterflies in my stomach had multiplied. I could feel my own pulse, beating high in my neck. But the main thing I felt was an old, familiar rush of euphoria. A feeling I hadn't had since the day I met George Willett. Over 2 years ago now, but I still remembered it. The kid had caught a puncture outside my house that needed fixing. I'd been only too happy to help him. Sorry, Nathan. I clicked the switch and the basement flooded with light. I could see the kid's broken body on the concrete below me, a rabbit that had stared into the headlights for too long. It's not what you were expecting, I know. But I can promise you this, you won't be lonely down there. Nathan was the second one I did after my wife died. It was harder at first, working alone, but I got used to it. I adapted. I guess that's all you can do, really. The one thing I always have working in my favor, the one thing that never really changes, is the kids. They're drawn to rumors and ghost stories like moths to a flame. What they don't understand, what none of them ever seem to understand, is that there's no such thing as bad houses. Not in real life. Only bad people. I began to hum as I descended the basement.